A question Fiona Wilkie raised in Mapping the Terrain, a survey of site-specific performance in Britain, was, can a performance tour? Some would say that a site-specific performance must exist in a single site, such as Helen Goldwater, who says to make a truly site-specific piece means it sits wholly in the site, both in its content and in its form. And so, performances that work in different sites could more aptly be named site-generic. Eileen Dillon's piece, Absent Water, can clearly be only labelled site-specific, as it takes inspiration from the site itself. The piece was based around the history of the bridge, but also a sensory exploration of the site itself, which was more of the focus of the piece by the end. The performance is a response, and if performed without the site, it becomes more of a contradiction, a performance about a place that no longer exists there, with responding to the parts of the bridge that will not exist on other bridges. So the performance couldn't work anywhere else but this bridge. Here, the rounded medieval arches are juxtaposed with ruins of angular church tower, old blankets and beer cans with lavender and buttercups, broken glass with feathers, damp brick with sun-dried red stone. And this may only be seen here, so if it was performed on a different bridge, the aspects that Eileen is responding to wouldn't be present. However, the same method of production could be used on different bridges, but this wouldn't create the original performance. Instead, it would create new site-specific pieces.
Absent Water by Eileen Dillon was through the initial stages of its creation, as explained in her documentation of said performance, in which she worked for 4 weeks with 4 performers and visual artists in order to create a site-specific performance. The next step in the shaping of this piece was the choice of location. The piece is performed in an outside environment, that being Exeter's medieval bridge. As Fiona Wilkie explains in her essay, outdoor site-specific performances are a common occurrence. The survey results suggest that it is almost twice as likely to take place outdoors as indoors. The average proportion of outdoor to indoor performance is 64 to 36%. 8 of the practitioners produce 100% outdoor productions, compared to 3 producing 100% indoor work and 12 respondents reporting that the proportion of their work is roughly 50-50. Dillon explains in her documentation that the piece was initially intended to be a text-driven piece of work. As expected by that chosen site, Exeter's medieval bridge would inspire a familiar starting point of narratives and issues. A text-driven piece of work does not always mean that a script as such was used in the creation and development of this performance. Lone Twins state that work that has no readable based writing that can be understood as textually driven. However, through devising a piece, it's evident that the idea of textually driven performance was shaped into a more visually and movement-based piece, which was evidently inspired by the site itself. Again, much like the fact that it's common for site-specific work to be created and performed outside, it offers a theatre-based site-specific work for one art. As Wilkie explains, in a few cases where the relationship differs from the theatre-based to the site-specific work of one practitioner, the site-specific work is less likely to be text-based. The reasons given for this refer to the practicalities of performing in the open air or in a site with distractions of the everyday. The theatre company Knee-High strengthened this argument by pointing out that the landscape theatre form uses text sparingly. Words cannot travel over distances or in strong winds.
Wilkie's essay, she talks about how the site of performance impacts the performance itself, stating that a site brings its own historical, cultural or political implications, which are then interwoven with other concerns and aesthetics into the final piece. Eileen Dillon's performance of Absent Water is particularly evocative of this, as she used the historical context of her site, such as its usage as the main route over the River Exe, its burial in 1778 and subsequent excavation in 1968. However, Dillon writes that she had a greater influence through sensory perception rather than historical backdrop, that it was the sight, sound, smell and touch of the bridge, and its inclusion and separation into the modern world that really inspired her. Wilkie also writes about this phenomenon, stating that the influence of a location can be more abstract and imaginative than purely literal. Dillon also writes that the performers discovered a difference between the movement that was generated when illustrating a story or an idea and the movement that was genuinely born out of sensory response to environment. Sensory movement draws the audience's attention to the environment as much as it does to the performer, creating what Dillon calls, at best, a conceptual link between performance and sight. Wilkie also addresses this in her essay, writing that projecting your ideas of performance and attempting to create a traditional stage would reduce the space that you have to work with, and as a result sever the connection between the audience and the site, as well as the performance and the site.
As I was focusing on the title of witnesses and who the target audience would be of our chosen performance, Absent Water by Eileen Dillon, I wanted to research and explore further into the piece to then signify the types of people who would be viewing it and be classed as the audience. I also had to consider the other elements of the piece, such as the location, and how this would make an impact on who the audience would be. I then discussed how this related to Fiona Wilkie's writing. In this case, as stated in the information and the writing on Absent Water, the audience would be two completely different types of people because of the time of day. Throughout the day, it would be ordinary people doing day-to-day activities in the space, such as walking their dogs or relaxing for the afternoon, eating their packed lunch. Whereas at night, this changes quite drastically, as the audience would then become homeless people that are already in the space, who are just trying to make a home and be settled for the night. And personally, I think this can give off a very strong response and opinion. This related to Wilkie and the quote she makes of Mason's theory, which he believes in, that is arguing that the purpose of making street theatre and site-specific performances is to connect and reach to people that wouldn't usually watch theatre and would be unfamiliar to theatre work, which is exactly what the piece Absent Water is doing.
The type of site Eileen Dillon uses for her performance of Absent Water, according to Fiona Wilkie's Mapping the Terrain survey, is a museum and ground as well as a park. This is because Dillon's choice of a site is a 20th century bridge in the heart of Exeter. It combines the publicness of a park as well as the historical nature of the site itself. Absent Water is surrounded by modern buildings, allowing Dillon to create a performance that was reflecting its own habitat. She used this to her advantage by using the knowledge she discovered about the bridge. It was one of the main access routes for over 500 years into the southwest, before it was surrounded by shrubbery. She also used it as an opportunity to explore the notion to comment on modern society through a sensory exploration she does of the bridge. Choosing this kind of site meant Dillon had to take into consideration many factors that may occur when performing near a road, such as traffic noise. Dillon combats this by deciding not to use text and instead to focus on visual means of her story, as text would be impossible. Also had to decide where she was to draw the boundaries of her site. Did she use the road to explore the passage of time and the change in architecture, or did she keep it within the bridge itself? In the end, she decided to keep it within the bridge itself, as it would have been too hard to either close off the road until to hear over the noise of the cars entirely for her performance, or to perform whilst traffic was happening.
How the spectators are managed and used in relation to Fiona Wilkie's taxonomy and the rights and sites piece Absent Water. Caroline Debbie states that the challenge in site-specific work is not only to attract a wide audience, but also to enable the audience to have a radically different relationship to the performance. In Absent Water, Associate Director Eileen Dillon explores potential new relationships by
employing a variety of techniques in order to manage what the spectators will discover. The performance consisted of a group movement towards the bridge over the River Exe, where an effective instalment from the actors took place alongside a visual artist's own instalment, then group movement away from the bridge, which is similar to our piece because we're leading them down a path and then there'll be an instalment in the middle and then leading them down the different spaces. Absent water was timed perfectly so there could be natural lighting throughout the piece. The audience moved towards the bridge in daylight and away from the bridge in darkness. The witness of transition from light to dark as the piece proceeds was one of the features that most impressed Dylan. The practitioner was aware that most of the people who would go to this particular performance wouldn't know much of the history of the bridge, while some wouldn't know any of it, even of its existence. This made the group movement pieces and the instalment something of a treasure hunt for the spectators. The middle section offered a chance for the viewers to explore, and the performers were placed around the site for the audience to encounter with the bridge itself. The actors used their own ideas, opinions and recognition of the place to give the audience an interpretation of what they wanted to show about their place in their own story, engaging with the audience in a friendlier fashion. One performer created a fire and made a little house for herself to add a sense of contemporary. Another became a fairy in purple lights and that. The discovery of the many elements allowed spectators to claim ownership, yet they were guided by the practitioners in order to become included with the piece. The notion of the event becomes a starting point of the spectator of many site-specific pieces, and in this case was with Absent Water. The knowing audience mingled with the unsuspecting accidental audience. The accidental audience, according to Bill Aitchison, adds to the complexity of the event. The notion of the process as well allowed for the fluid and provisional audience, as Fiona Wilkie predicted, could happen within site-specific piece. Rights and Sights Theatre Company behind the key thing claimed that they are interested in the place and the people who meet us in that place. Absent Water, according to one audience member, succeeded in the intention to allow the audience to experience the site in a new way.